Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Easter break flip. Yes, that's right, your one and only Easter break flip. I was going to do like two of them and stuff like that. I decided not to, though, right? So the big thing about it, though, as we get into it, we're now talking about, or we left off in class, in D period and G period, not C period, because y'all haven't learned about that stuff in class yet, but you'll have this same flip when you come back from Easter break. But we left off talking about nationalism and the growth of imperialism. So the big thing about that nationalism aspect is the fact that nationalism is when Europe is also taking over these countries with imperial gains as a form of nationalism, as that pride perspective, right? And we looked at, or we're going to look at in class with this ABCs for baby patriots, right? So this was a children's book that exemplifies that idea that Europeans wanted to take over other lands so they could grow their national influence and be able to basically say, hey, look, France, we have more stuff than you do, right? So like in this idea of growing your power and influence in your military respects. So this book right here is a good... Oh, good Lord, that's gross. All right, so an ABCs for Baby Patriots, right? 1899 is when it was issued by Mrs. Ernest Ames. And as we can see, instead of having like A is for apple and B is for banana, it has stuff like B is for battles and C stands for colonies. Rightly we boast that of all great nations, Great Britain has the most, right? Which ties back in to our the sun never sets on the British Empire concept, right? This is a very important motivator, and it's the main motivator behind imperialism in the late 1800s is the idea of nationalism, right? Relating back to that military dominance and military takeover and the growth of these different empires. So that going forward, though, as well, there are going to be other smaller motivations like religion, military outposts, foreign markets, things like that, right? The other smaller motivators are basically like, oh, we're trying to spread Christianity. Other ones being like, oh, we want a military fort so we can keep an eye on other countries. Or the idea that we want to sell different goods to these people that we're taking over, right? So that's other smaller motivations. But the biggest example of other big things about when it comes to imperialism is like, why now? Like, why now? Why is imperialism all of a sudden changing face in the late 1800s? Why in the late 1800s is all of a sudden imperialism going from colonies to being military takeovers? Well, a lot of it has to do with post-industrial technology, right? After the Industrial Revolution, technology is going to take a gigantic leap forward. And this new technology is going to help Europeans spread their influence further and further like they never have and never had the ability to previously, right? For example, this is a big thing. The Maxim gun, right? The Maxim gun, which was invented in 1885, is the very first fully automatic machine gun, right? As in fully automatic, you hold down the trigger and the bullets keep coming out. The Maxim machine gun could fire about 200 rounds per minute without, well, jammed pretty often, but it still could fire about 200 rounds per minute, only taking one person to operate it, right? Remember, this is in stark contrast to like the muskets that Europeans have been fighting with for about like 2 centuries before that, where you could only fire 2 shots per minute. This fires 200 shots per minute. Now, no matter what group of people, what local indigenous group of people goes up against that weapon, they simply have no chance to be able to stop it, right? But the Maxim gun is going to be invented in 1885 along with several other rifles, including breech-loading rifles and semi-automatic rifles that are going to just give the militaries of these countries the ability to spread their influence so far. Then you've also got steam-powered vessels, right? Steam-powered transportation is going to be a massive thing that lurches this imperialism forward because the steamboats and factories and machines are going to make it so they can now travel further without stopping and then also bring goods back without stopping, right? So steam power is going to be much more efficient than wind power, and these steam-powered vessels can now traverse rivers. They have low like berths, so they can actually like go through shallow waters, and then they can also travel from places like England all the way to the different coasts of Africa and all the way through the Mediterranean. So that is a huge thing. But then there's another really big one that's super important that you need to highlight, circle, underline, make it look like it's exploding. We're talking about this stuff right here, quinine medicine, right? So like quinine is from a plant in South America, and this is what the plant itself actually looks like. But the thing about it is, quinine had been discovered and been being used by the Incan empires for hundreds and hundreds of years. They just made an effort to never tell Europeans about this specific medicine, right? Well, this medicine that grows in the rainforests of like South America will get a bark on the outside of it. If you strip that bark and boil it down, you can make quinine medicine, which basically eliminates the symptoms of malaria. Now, malaria and that disease, malaria, was a big thing that prevented Europeans from being able to push further into places like India, from pushing further into places like Africa. So this quinine medicine will make it so Europeans can now be immune to the disease that was preventing them from going further than they actually had before 1850, right? Now, for example, quinine is like a liquid substance. Usually British soldiers would actually drink it in their daily gin and tonics, right? So like quinine medicine is going to be a very important thing, which is going to basically shift the tides and is going to give the ability of these Europeans to go in and basically ransack, kill, murder, steal, and take things from people that have no business even interacting with, in continents like Africa and Southeast Asia, where they should have just stayed out of. So speaking of continents like Africa and Southeast Asia, we are now going to move on to some specific examples of imperialism. And the first one we're going to talk about is right here, the imperialization of China by the British, right? So the British in China is going to be a very important example of imperialism. We're going to have three specific examples of imperialism by the time that this unit or this section of the unit is done. We will talk about the British in China, we will talk about the British in India, and then we will talk about all of Europe basically carving up and stealing Africa from African people, right? So the British in China is a very key place to start though, because you have to basically ask yourself, why are we going? So the thing about the British in China is that you have to be able to do that thing that y'all all hate doing, which is of course rewinding all the way back to the 1790s. Now, so if we're going to understand the imperialism of China, we have to be able to jump all the way back to basically what's going on in Britain during their Industrial Revolution and jump all the way backwards to the 1790s, right? So in the 1790s, you need to understand that Britain is broke, right? So Britain, in Great Britain, is broke as a joke when it comes to their government and their former wartime economics, right? They're very, very poor because, on a government perspective, because these wars in the American Revolution have been leaving them with absolutely no money, right? Wars like the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and their ability to be able to actually wage war and win war has been severely affected. And so the big thing about it is they're running out of money. Now, it's not going to be that way forever. The Industrial Revolution is going to make them a ton of money, but it's only in its infancy at this point because at the 1790s, James Watt's steam engine is only about 20 years old, and it hasn't even really been applied full scale yet, right? So the thing about it is Britain does not have a lot of money. Thing about it is, though, China is not broke, right? China is very, very wealthy. China is also very wealthy mainly due to this concept known as economic isolationism, right? Economic isolationism in the sense that China has goods and products that the rest of the world wants, and they have economically isolated themselves away to the point where they're like, look, y'all have this, y'all want what we have. We're not going to you to bring it to you. If you want it, come get it from us. And by the way, if you want to come get all the stuff that we have, like porcelain, tea, silk, other different items that are actually printed fabrics and all these things that are super, super expensive, especially the porcelain. Europeans have tried for hundreds of years to make porcelain on the level of Chinese porcelain, and they could never do it, and even when they tried to make their own, it was still garbage, right? So everybody wants these Chinese goods, and the Chinese government says, since you want them so bad, you'll understand that there is only one city that you can go to trade with us, and it's called Canton, right? Canton is one city on the port side of China in southeast China, whereas the only city that Europeans are allowed to go to pick up goods and bring them back. It is a very ingenious system. It keeps China very, very safe. It keeps them economically isolated, and it has been a system that has kept them very wealthy and very prosperous for several hundred years. Well, the British are a little upset as well because they are addicted to a product that China has. They are losing money not only on wars, but their households are also losing money on their tea addiction, right? You have to understand the big thing that's going to end up happening in the late 1790s is that British people are going to become addicted to caffeine, and they're going to become addicted to caffeine in the form of tea. Some British households are spending as much as 10% of their yearly income on tea coming from China because it's something that they ingrained into their culture, and they had a time for it, and that's what they always drank. While the rest of the continent's drinking coffee, the British are drinking tea, right? It's just like when we saw with the Boston Tea Party. Tea is an important resource for the British, and they're losing a lot of money on it because China is so economically isolated, and Chinese tea is very expensive, right? So the British come up with a thing. They're like, what's a good that the Chinese people might want that we could trade them for tea? Oh, I have an idea. How about drugs? So the thing about it is they decide with one of the most disgusting, screwed up events in all of history that they're going to trade Chinese traders opium for tea, right? So not really a fair trade in this sense, but you have to understand that opium is going to be grown in India. This, by the way, is opium. Opium is a flower, okay? It comes from a poppy plant. Some of y'all may have interacted with this stuff in this scene from a very famous movie.
And now, my beauty, something with poison in it, I think. With poison in it, but attractive to the eye and soothing to the smell. Poppies. Poppies will put them to sleep. Sleep.
What's happening? What is it? I can't run anymore. I'm so sleepy.
Here, give us your hands and we'll pull you along.
Oh, no, please. I have to rest for just a minute. Toto, where's Toto?
Oh, you can't rest now. We're nearly there.
Exactly, right? That is the scene from Wizard of Oz where, like, they run into the poppy fields and they all fall asleep because opium is a depressant, right? Opium is also going to be used to make modern-day things like heroin, methadone, and opium-based painkillers, right? So it's a massive depressant. That's why Dorothy and the guys fall asleep, right? So the big thing about it, though, in the long run, is looking at this opium drug and stuff like that. It's crazy illegal in China, right? The British plan to grow opium poppies in India and then trade it to the Chinese for tea and sell it for a profit in England. So the idea would be that they would grow opium for next to nothing in India and then meet Chinese traders in the water and then exchange chests of opium for chests of tea, and the Chinese traders would then illegally smuggle it back into China and sell it to people because of how illegal it is. Opium is not something that the Chinese government wants in their society. It's stupid illegal for a reason, because people can't live lives and work on opium. Opium sends you into a deep slumber state where it basically knocks you out, makes you catatonic, and then also it's highly addictive, and people die from it overdosing regularly when they use it illegally and they smoke it illicitly, right? So the thing about it is the Chinese are trying to figure out, whoa, where is all this opium all of a sudden showing up? The British did this anyway. They did it anyway, knowing it was illegal, knowing it was the wrong thing to do, all because they wanted to open a closed China. So you have to understand that's a big word that's going to get thrown around here right now. China was closed to the rest of the world, right? And you said they said that you could only like trade with them in one city. Well, the Brits are going to change that when they start opening China, quote unquote, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, is this is going to lead to a series of wars known as the Opium Wars, very aptly named. The Chinese are going to try to stop the sale of opium by dumping it and seizing it at ports, right? There was this one very famous event, actually, where a Chinese ambassador sent by the Dowager Emperor, because it was the Qing dynasty that was actually ruling over China at the time, who had brought them into 200 years of glorious celestial kingdomness. The thing about it is the Qing dynasty hires a man by the name of Lin Jisoo, and Lin Jisoo is right here, who is a Chinese diplomat who decides to create a massive campaign of seizing these chests of opium from Chinese smugglers at these different ports and dumping it into the water and destroying it, right? And he actually seized at one point 21,000 chests of the stuff from a British vessel and destroyed it. And then guess what also, by the way, Lin Jisoo even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria trying to be like, hey, can you please tell your East India Company to stop selling illegal drugs to my people? I'm asking you very nicely. And then apparently Queen Victoria never saw the letter. Yeah, okay. So now, the big thing about it, though, in the long run, is he destroys these 21,000 chests of opium, and then the Brits had the audacity to demand money for the destroyed product, and he was like, no, we're not going to give you money for the illegal drug that you're trying to trade for tea. So the Brits demanded compensation for their drugs, and the Opium Wars broke out when the Chinese refused to compensate them, right? The first one is going to rage from 1839 to 1842, and the second one's going to rage later on from 1853 to 1860. That was a lot of this this arsenic bread and this bakery and all this other stuff. But the thing about it is that the Chinese are going to lose these wars because they were technologically behind the British, right? In the first Opium War, they lose in a dramatic fashion due to the fact that most Chinese, if they have guns, are using muskets. And if they don't have guns, they're using swords and bows and arrows. Because of the fact that they were economically isolated and so prosperous using what they were doing, they never had a need to actually advance new military weaponry and things like that. Most of the Chinese vessels, as you can see, are still wind-powered, and they're being attacked by steam-powered vessels, as you can see right over here in the actual background of this. That is actually going to be a steam-powered boat that was able to destroy Chinese boats and naval fleets very, very easily. Oh, by the way, the Americans, the French, and the Russians also helped out the British in the actual Opium Wars and helped destroy Chinese militaries, and they're going to forcefully open China, quote unquote. And what's going to happen is they're going to establish these things known as the Century of Humiliation and Spheres of Influence, right? China would be opened and the spheres of influence would be established. What a sphere of influence is basically these colored areas on the map. So right here, this is the area that Russia wanted to trade in. Right here is the area for the French. Yeah, that's the area for the Germans, actually. This green area is the area for the Brits. This is the area that Japan ends up taking over, and the French end up taking over French Indochina. Spheres of influence basically saying that the French will trade here and take all these goods from China. The British will be here, and they basically take over land that they had no business taking over. China was open. The spheres of influence will be established. All the Chinese ports were open to international trade. Britain is going to own Hong Kong literally up until the 1990s. Merchants also would not be subject to Chinese laws, but only to the ones of their own country, and the Chinese had to pay them for the Opium Wars. This starts what's known as the Century of Humiliation, or about 100 years of time where China was humiliated by the Europeans because of their desire to open them up and actually take their goods from them. Rebellions will rise up against this, like the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion that we'll talk about in class, and these uprisings would be crushed by coalition armies of French, Russian, American, English armies, and millions of Chinese lives would be lost. Over 20 million died in the Taiping Rebellion alone. But that right there is going to be where we're going to hold off on this, and we're going to talk more about imperialism when I see y'all in class. Y'all have a good one.